Hello, fellow foodies. Welcome back. Dr. Cassandra Quave here, and we've got a fascinating new episode of Foodie Pharmacology for you this week. We're going to explore some plants in the cypress genus found at the Andean foothills of southern Colombia that are used in traditional shamanic practices. We're also going to discuss traditional practices associated with yahe shamanism and the use of ayahuasca and other powerful medicinal plants. If you're interested in the power of plants, you can also check out my book, The Plant Hunter, which is coming out on October 12th. In it, I share my journey developing new ways to fight illness and disease through the healing power of plants. To learn more or to pre-order a copy, head to my website at cassandraquave.com. Now, today, I'm really excited to chat with Dr. Hernando Echeverri Sanchez. He's a social anthropologist with an interest in ethnobotany, medical anthropology, and human ecology. His research on the shamanic networks of Western Amazonia. And for the last 5 years, he's closely collaborated with ayahuasca or yahe shamans from the Putumayo, Colombia region, conducting extensive fieldwork in the city of Macau. It's great to see you, Hernando. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Cassandra. It's nice to finally meet you, and I'm a fan of your work. It's really great to be here.
Thanks. Well, I'm excited to speak with someone who knows so much about, the western part of South America. It's kind of where I got my first exposure to ethnobotany, just a little bit further south from you in Peru.
Yeah.
And I actually encountered some of the plants that you're doing a lot of really fascinating research on. So I'm really excited to learn more about these traditions in Colombia. Why don't we start with just giving us a bit of an overview around what are shamanic networks and how do shaman exchange knowledge throughout the western part of South America?
So in Colombia, what we call yahe, or what most people call ayahuasca, exists very separate from like Peruvian or Ecuadorian or even Brazilian shamanic practices. In Colombia, the yahe shamans are a very unique type of traditional medicine tied to different ethnicities what we or Colombian anthropologists call the shamanic networks, or the people of yahe. These people live mostly in Putumayo, Colombia, which you might see a picture of the map, south of Colombia, near the border of Ecuador. So the river Putumayo is the border between Ecuador and Colombia, and just above the Rio Putumayo, we have the region, which is multi-ethnic and very diverse, at least biologically diverse, because it also contains a large part of the Andean foothills and the lowlands. So the shamanic networks that we see in that region are shamans from the highlands who live in ecosystems that are very similar to, for example, temperate forests, even though they don't have those shifts of the seasons. It's cold, usually 15 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure in Fahrenheit how much that is, but it's usually pretty cold, and it can get to over 3,000 meters high. So it's what we call páramo in Colombia. And it's a unique ecosystem that's almost like before snow caps. And then you go down towards the lowlands, which has like the lowland flood rivers. The shamans from the highlands, they can't grow many of the shamanic plants that are used for their healing practices. So they have, through the centuries, even before pre-Columbian times. So there's evidence of this trade since the Inca arrived to that region, or even before that. So that trade has been working since then, and is still ongoing many of the shamans that are from the highlands need the medicines from the lowlands, so they travel to the lowlands. They not only trade their own medicines, because the highlands has also a huge diversity of medicinal plants, but they also travel. They also exchange knowledge. So, like for example, the shamans from the highlands are very well known for their use of another shamanic plant called borrachero or brugmansias. I don't know. You know which ones?
Yeah,
The
it's in the
trumpet flowers.
Solanaceae family, right? The
Yes,
potato tomato family. Yes.
the trumpet flowers.
Mm-hmm.
They're extremely dangerous, but these shamans from the highlands, they have a history of cultivating and creating varieties of these brugmansias. So they have beautiful different varieties.
Is
And
this known as Toé? Is that what they call it?
no,
Or,
actually,
no.
in Colombia, it's not known as Toé. It's known as Toé in Peru or in Bolivia. But in Colombia, we call it borrachero, which means
Borrachero. The
drunken
drunken.
person, like the drunken plant, because there's a myth that if you lie under it and you smell and you go to sleep under it, you will wake up like drunk.
Okay, kind of like hallucinating from this hallucinogenic
it's a
plant.
very powerful plant, and there's a lot of association with witchcraft with that plant. So those highland shamans, they know all about these plants, and they trade it with the people from the lowlands who have the knowledge of ayahuasca, Banestereopsis capi, and the other big mix in the Dipteris cabrerana. No, those in Colombia, it's not. They don't use Psychotria viridis. They use Dipteris cabrerana, which is also from the Rubiaceae.
Okay, so in the coffee family.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's get into the recipes for ayahuasca in a bit, because I think this is really interesting how all these different ingredients work together. But what you're saying is basically that you have different shamanic practices, but through these trade networks, there's exchange of knowledge and plants.
So even the highland, there are different ethnic groups. So from the highlands, they're the Cametza, the Inga, and from the lowlands, they're the Cofan, the Siona, the Quichua. They have different languages, they have different cultures, but they share similar shamanic practices because of that network. So, for example, highland shamans go to the lowlands to learn from become apprentices of lowland shamans, and they take that knowledge and teach it up in the highlands, and vice versa. No, there's sometimes people go up to the highlands to learn about certain plants, and there's an exchange of knowledge between. So the interesting thing is that these networks, they function mostly through trade. So like they function like, oh yes, I'll give you money to buy ayahuasca, but I not only give you money, I can give you instruments, I can give you other medicinal plants to cover the cost of the ayahuasca, because ayahuasca is generally pretty expensive for the people from the highlands. So there's this network of trade, and usually the ethnic group that is specialized in that trade are called the Inga, which are which have like a Quichua dialect, and they live from the highlands to the lowlands, and they have also spread throughout the country. And they're like, if you go to in Bogota or Cali or Medellin, the other big cities of Colombia, to the markets of herbal medicines, it's usually an Inga shaman who you meet, and they will sell you the plants that you are looking for. So these Ingas have spread the Ayahe shamanic practices throughout the country, towards even Venezuela. They even have some Venezuela. So that's how it's very different to what you find in Peru and Ecuador and Brazil.
Well, let's deconstruct a bit, like what ayahuasca is. Some of our audience may have heard of it before. It's become this kind of trendy thing of ayahuasca circles in the U.S., which is, frankly divorced from its real utility and meaning that we see in traditional medicine, which is a really sacred use. What can you tell us about how ayahuasca is made. We know that it has many different species, but also what does ayahuasca really mean? What is its symbolism for these healers?
So ayahuasca means the plant of the soul, or the connection to the soul. It's the umbilical cord to the heavens, or it's because it's a vine, no, that grows. They usually, at least in most places, usually call ayahuasca only one plant, which is Banisteriopsis capi. The other mix, that is the ayahuasca plant. That is the yahe plant. In Colombia, we call it yahe, but it's because in Colombia, we have a very unique shamanic practice. But the yahe plant, Banisteriopsis capi, has like MAO inhibitors and harmonics that are like chemicals that help you if you drink plants, or if you consume it with plants that contain DMT. It helps you keep the DMT and helps your stomach process the DMT and allows for a longer trip
Longer
or
sensory experience. Yeah. I've always found that fascinating. So just to deconstruct this, MAOI stands for a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Basically, if you were to take a plant that contains DMT, it would be rapidly broken down in your gut. But in the presence of the MAOIs, it slows that breakdown down, and then you have, instead of a very rapid breakdown, it stays in your body longer, and you have an experience that can last in terms of hours, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the beauty of this biochemistry that they have, ethnic chemistry that have, and these MAOs also function to they also function to incorporate other medicines. So at least the shamans that I've worked with, they not only mix it with the caurenara, Diplopteris caurenara, but they mix it with other medicinal plants to give it more strength, because ayahuasca, the B-capi, the MAO inhibitors, they are allowed for the body to process, to consume, or to ingest all of these chemicals. And it's a pretty wild like practice. And ethnohistorically, it might have come. There's some evidence that it comes from another plant, which is commonly used throughout the Americas, peregrina, and Andreacea peregrina, what we call yopo. It's a snuff.
Ah, the yopo snuff. Yeah.
And so there's ethnohistorically, it's tied more to that, because yopo snuff, you not only need, is where you consume the DMT, but you need the yahe vine to process it and to have the experience.
What is the plant name again of the yopo snuff?
Anatheraceae peregrina.
Okay, what family is that in?
And you cut me up.
Oh no, not to put you on the spot. I was thinking of, I recall, if I'm remembering correctly, there's some books.
I know it's a Fabaceae. Sorry.
Fabaceae. Okay, yeah. I'm trying to think back to some old photos I'd seen in one of Schulte's books that has. I think is that the snuff where they basically blow it into your partner's nose through a bird bone. Is that the snuff? Yes. Okay.
So there's two snuffs. Well, there's actually three snuffs. That one, you also have the tobacco snuffs, which are very common in that shamanic practices, and it's very widespread. Tobacco, because it's one of those magical plants that is throughout Latin America. And you have the virola one, which
Virola snuff. Yes.
Which is much more from it's closer to Brazil. In Colombia, it's more, and like in the Caribbean, Anandreaceae was the main snuff that they use, and it needs that capi or yahe vine to
the harmala
actually
alcohol.
Yeah.
I think what's fascinating is like when people hear about ayahuasca, they often think that it itself is the source of hallucinogenic properties, but it's not. It's actually really a potentiator.
Yeah.
I think the harmala compounds have some antidepressant activities on their own because of that, MAOI connection, but it's really the other ingredients. So it's long fascinated me how people sorted this out, that you take this plant, you combine it with that plant, and then you have this enhanced effect. And it's
Yeah,
just
yeah. It's
amazing the knowledge, how
amazing.
it's been built and transferred.
So there's another thing about BCAP or the MAO inhibitors and harmaline is that it also creates the purging effects. No, it helps you the emetic and the diuretic effects, which are often overlooked, but for that type of medicine, they're vital. No,
Yeah.
part of the medicine is purging yourself out of the sickness. So it can't be overlooked. It's a really vital and central part of what local communities understand as healing.
Of
So
purging the body through inducing vomiting, inducing also as a laxative to induce.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
laxative.
So you have this. Yeah. This is really important. You're right,
So
because a lot of
I
medical
always
theory is based in that purging the body.
yeah, I always find it crazy that people basically like are ashamed of that because they often say, oh, it's the side effects, but it's like for
Yeah.
the shamanic traditions, for the like local Yahe tradition, is probably one of the most important. So they have a huge list of plants that produce the same, like the vomiting and the laxative effects, and it's probably the most important thing they have out of their arsenal. So yeah.
So, can you tell us a bit about why would a shaman take yahe? Why would they consume it? In my experiences, I was told that shamans would take this as a kind of a diagnostic process, or to understand how to determine what was wrong with their patient, and also to find the remedies for the patients. Is that the same as it is in Peru, as in Colombia, that it's kind of a tool for learning how to heal your patient?
Yeah, traditionally it was more towards that because yes, basically the shaman was the only one that drank yahe out of of the during the
Ceremonies.
ceremonies and during the diagnostic ceremonies, because they were more like diagnostic ceremonies. It's like going to a doctor, and the doctor uses X-rays to see what's inside you, to see
Yeah.
what's happening to you. It's they see it as that. At least the shamans that I talk to, they're like, oh yes, they use other shamanic tools like crystals and music and their fan
The
to like,
shakapa.
we call it guaira in Colombia.
Why? Is it a
Guaira,
kind
which
of
is a, sorry?
grass, right? Is it Pariana species also?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
That's great.
So it's and it makes a beautiful noise that is
Lovely.
so
Rustling.
that's so they use those things to like diagnose the patient and to diagnose not only the patient but the world at large, because you have to remember that they don't see you as an individual. You exist in a world where there are spirits, there are non-humans, there are a bunch of other denizens that might that see you as prey, that see you as an ally, that see you as an annoyance, and that you have to negotiate with them. And it was a vital tool for example, before hunting, because you need to negotiate with the owners of the animals, because the owners are also some denizen in the jungle. It's not human, it's not animal, it's some spiritual type being. You have to talk to them so that they give you permission to hunt their herds. And so the shaman was the link between the visual world and the invisible world. And that's how, and yahe or ayahuasca, it was the tool to enter the invisible world. And most of those hallucinogenics in Latin America have been used in that similar fashion. No? It's a tool to enter the world of the spirits, or to enter the invisible world. So, but now, due to the growing tourism, because it's not only in Peru that we have a huge industry of ayahuasca tourism. In Colombia, it's big, but it's localized because Colombia has a history of violence. Foreign tourists are more afraid of going to Colombia. So the shamans, it's usually like elites from Bogota or from the big cities that go to the shamans, and due to that, it's changed the whole way of practicing and consuming yahe. They've opened it up to anybody who wants to go, and it's now seen as not only that the shaman can see the invisible world, but you can also see it. The person can also see it, and the shaman wants you to be drunk with yahe, because we call it drunk because you're like disoriented. Borracho con yahe. You have to be drunk so that the shaman actually sees the real you, the real problem, so that they can hunt it or like cure you.
And cure you, yeah. This is fascinating because, as you mentioned, it's you see this change in the utility, and I mean, traditional knowledge and the use of plants we know is constantly changing. This is true. It's constantly being molded through different people that and different cultures that kind of encounter these plants. When it comes to the use of yahe outside of the diagnostic realm and more of kind of a in some ways it's being used also for mental health treatments. What can you tell us about that? And there are some dangers with that as well because of the MAOIs. If you're on medications already for mental health, it could prove quite deadly even if you mix those medications.
That's probably one of the major risks. That and the overconsumption of tobacco during ceremonies. That's one of those big things that people just assume that it's fine, and they just go and drink yahe, and it has a huge effect on them and can cause death. And it's really important for anybody who's listening to be careful with that type of them if they're interested in this topic. Tobacco is also, I feel like, one of those things that people don't talk about, but it's really dangerous because if in high enough doses and you consume tobacco, and they consume tobacco in different forms, cigarettes, like cigars, the snuff, the ambil, which is the paste. And if you consume too much, it can also poison you because it's nicotine is a poison at the end of the day. So so it's very important for people to be aware of these things if they're interested in this type of plant. This type of medicine.
This is another interesting point because when we think about tobacco, it's become so commonplace across the globe. It's so accessible, but historically it was a ritual plant. It still is a ritual, ritually sacred, an important plant. But you're right. The levels of consumption and modes of consumption can certainly be toxic if you take too much of anything. I think there's this misconception that people have that anything that's natural is safe when it is not. There are a lot of things in nature that will kill you if you take too much of them. Yeah,
and that's the case with most of the traditional medicines. The shamans, they have their own recipes. They have their own lifelong experience that they've managed to and tradition, because it's also like a huge tradition of like how much you should include of certain plants, which prevents many of these problems of like overuse or like self-poisoning. So if it's important to know this, because there will be a lot of new shamans because of the interest. There's so many young new shamans who are just decide to become a yahe, and they don't really have any training. They don't have the long tradition of moving through those networks of shamans, and they can do harm, and they can actually cause harm to people. And it's it's a risky world to negotiate if you're going to that landscape. So
Yeah. Well, and I think, like as you say, like the importance of that long tradition of training and of learning across environments in the highlands and lowlands can't be underestimated. Is that knowledge is key. I know that, well, not just with ayahuasca, but with many other powerful medicinal plants, there's a lot more that goes into these formulations than just the identity of the plant. You have to think about the age of when the plant is harvested. You know, they may wait until it's a certain for the ayahuasca vine until it's a certain girth because that indicates
yeah,
a certain age that it has. Or other plants are collected early in the morning, or all these little details that may seem strange or maybe not as important on the surface actually can be really closely tied to the chemical makeup of those plants, and in
yeah.
the end have major consequences for the final pharmacological properties of that final product.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So then it's interesting to see how these things that you're talking about, for example, the age, the different times that you have to harvest it, it exists in it's a very like fundamental part of shamanic interaction with their plant medicines, and it's part of their respect to their, so that maybe not they don't understand it, or maybe it's not seen as a like, oh yes, it's because this has this effect when it's later in the day. It's because you have to respect the plant. The plant tells you
Hmm.
something that when you harvest it in the morning, it's more available to cure than in the afternoon. It's the agency of the plant, no, and you have to respect that. And that's the beauty of that tradition, no? It's gives a plant that you usually, it's like, oh yes, it's a plant. It's usually like in the background of our world. It has a world change for them. It has a world changing agency that I don't really. There are not many communities that have that perspective or belief system, which
Yeah.
is quite beautiful at the end of the day. So yeah, and tying it to the Chandur, it's basically the same, no? It's like, how do we deal with these agencies of plants? Chandur is one of these tools they use to negotiate with the agency of the plants when they're using them.
So yeah, let's talk about Chandor. So if Chandor is a local name, if I'm understanding correctly, for a sedge plant that's in the cypress genus. I know that, again, my knowledge is limited to a certain part of Peru, but there are also sedges. They go by the name of piri piri, and these are also have some interesting psychoactive properties. I'm wondering, can you tell us, what is Chandor? How is it used within
Yeah.
these shamanic networks or in the practice of shamanism?
So Chandur, as you said, is a little hedge. A lot of those. I'm sorry, there's a dog barking in the
It's
background.
okay.
A lot of those shamanic Chandurs are used primarily to negotiate. I'm sorry, I lost my track of that.
Oh, it's okay. Rob, we can just pause for a second and Rob
Yes,
can clip this
there's
part
the
out.
dogs are out and about and they're barking. So
So
uh,
I'll start back with the question so that way
yeah,
we can have a
sorry.
fresh starting point for Rob. Um, so can you tell us, what is Chandur? I know it is a sedge that belongs to the cypress genus, and in Peru, these go by the name of piri piri, but also very important kind of psychoactive ingredient. How is Chandur used in Colombia?
So Chandura, as you said, is a cypress plant in Colombia, like in Peru and most places in throughout the Amazon. Chandur is, there's many different varieties of Chandur. Chandur is like basically a
Mm.
catch-all term to a different species of sedges. So like they say like, oh yes, this is this type of Chandur. There's different types of Chandur. So like, for example, tiger Chandur, Danta Chandur, Hentep Chandur, people Chandur, like, and different chondures, and sometimes they're different species, but then sometimes they're not. Sometimes you don't. I can't tell the difference, but the shamans, they definitely can tell the difference, and they have a difference through their effects. So it's a very conspicuous plant. You can't barely see it when you're walking through the forest, but the shamans are constantly growing it. They have their own collection of different chondures. It's pretty easy to grow. You just buy, you can get the little rhizomes and just put it in the ground, and it grows pretty easily. And how they use it is they use those rhizomes, they smash them with like a wooden mallet, and then put them in alcohol. Chondur, the species of chondur that I identified most was Cyperus articulatus, which is also a very important cypress for perfume industry. It has a beautiful,
interesting,
aromatic, like musky smell that lasts for a long time. And when they put them in the alcohol, it infuses the alcohol with the essential oils of the chondur, and it makes the alcohol smell of chondur. And they use it by blowing it, like how shamans, they drink a little bit and then they blow it.
It's kind of like spit out in like a fine mist onto the patient, or
exactly onto the patient. And then you end up with the smell of chondur, and they use it to cleanse. They use it, so like for example that white fan, the fan that we were talking about, they commonly they blow at it with the chondur, they clean it. So it's a very important plant for the cleansing ceremony, which is like it's the vital part of shamanic practices. No, it's not ayahuasca is the showy, but like oh yes, everybody is interested in that. But cleansing ceremonies are what you do is when you're feeling sick, you go to a shaman and they will cleanse you, and they will see, and then they might say like it's usually tied into like spiritual diseases, so mal de ojo, bad eye, brujeria, sometimes witchcraft. So it's tied to like local spiritual diseases. And chondur is like a vital part in the ayahuasca ceremony because of that cleansing practice. So they use it, they blow chondur throughout the maloca, throughout the ceremonial place. They blow chondur to the where they put the yahe. They blow like into the cups. They blow chondur into the air. They blow chondur into each patient. It's cleaning the space, more similar to I think in Peru they use some smudging agents, some instances. But in Colombia, they use chondur primarily.
Chondur this way.
And it's quite fascinating because it has a very particular set of moments during the ceremonies that it's used. So you use it at the beginning, 2 times during the ceremony, and at the end. I found the most interesting in those 2 moments and during the ceremony, because for the shamans, for the patients who are having some trouble with the ayahuasca, with the yahe, it is a calming agent. So they blow chondur at you when you're feeling, when the person is feeling like he can't walk right, when the person is going through like a strong effect. It helps the shaman manage the ceremony. And that's why it's such an important tool, because it allows for the shaman to guide the person. So like it not only guides you through it gives you temporality, it also gives you like the ritual moments when you now this is where we start from this is where we change the dynamics, and they tie it up with music, with the white fan. And it's interesting because during with ayahuasca and DMT, you have some synesthesia where the smell produces certain effects and certain effects like visual effects. So when they do a cleansing with the chondur, it produces an effect of well-being. And I have reports of people saying like, oh yes, I see like beautiful things when they're blowing chondur at me, because that smell changes what they're seeing or how they're having their experience to like a more calm, more peaceful like mindset, you could say that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's fascinating, because it's often overlooked, but the importance for the shamans for that is vital. And chondur is also used for, like, for example, to hunt people, to throw arrows at witchcraft. It's like it's their secret little tool they have in their pockets when they need to need to either calm the ceremony or do other things. So I found that pretty amazing, and there was nothing written about it, so I had to write about this plant. Yeah.
It's fascinating. Well, I think one of the things that attracts me to this genus in particular is also some of those studies have been done with the fungal endophytes that are involved with this plant. And so there's the question of who's producing some of the chemistries in these plants. Is it the fungal endophytes, or is it, the plant itself, or are both necessary for the final products?
So it's been reported that, but I actually didn't record any use, like hallucinogenic use, because most of the fungal endocytes grow in the flowering.
Yes, in the flowering tubs.
In the flowering tubs, but shamans where I worked with, they use only the rhizomes. So it's I'm not sure if that's why I never recorded any of, because I know about this, that like the ergot mushroom, and everybody keeps saying like, oh my god, the ergot, but I never saw it. But there might what like, for example, Timothy Plowman, who was one of the first ones who worked on this, was saying is like maybe it was how they discovered the plant, and then it changed and it morphed into the different uses that we see today. I'm not sure if why, the hallucinogenic properties of chundur as from that regard is, I haven't seen it, but I've seen what I'm telling you, like the use of like managing the visions and making people see like healing elements and different
fascinating. Well, what else is fascinating to me is that, unlike ayahuasca, which is not typically cultivated, right? It's wild. These are specifically cultivated by shaman for specific purposes, because you mentioned they have many different utilities. This one has this property, that one has this one. I mean, that shows a lot of intent, just like we cultivate certain crops, right, for food.
Yes, exactly.
There's been a lot of intention into these. Yeah,
exactly. It's fascinating. And then you have like, in the paper I only specify two plants, one which is tied to the jaguar shaman, because the shaman has a tie to because the jaguar, there's a lot of symbolism in how the shaman hunts the disease in you as a jaguar hunts in the forest. And the air is another big waida, or air is another big symbolism that ties to like breathing. A lot of how people understand life comes from how they breathe. But there's so many different other types. You have trueno, which is thunder, which they use to I've heard so many beautiful stories. Like a shaman, one of the most powerful, because it's a lot of the tradition in that shamanic. It's about stories about how like other shamans, like hero stories. Other shamans did this and this, and can you believe it? They did this. So there's one about one of the most important shamans in Colombia, Taita Queta. He's like the eminence. And there's a story that some guerrilla came to him to like ask for like to like leave the territory, and like they kicked his pot of yahe, and then he spilled it, and then he used the trueno chundur and mixed it and like tied it to and like linked with the spirits or with the energies of thunder, and threw a thunder to the guerrilla camp. So there's that's like how this symbol, it's like tied between symbolism and like practical use, and we can't really think of these varieties as like, oh, it's because of their physical attributes, it's because of their cultural attributes, their existence in a wider network of shamans, and not only shamans, of other beings that exist in the region. So it's trying to understand this region more as a pluriverse of different worlds and different networks of human and non-human. That's how like you end up working there, and you end up seeing this. You're like, oh my god, this is amazing.
I like this. This pluriverse is a nice term for it. Absolutely, it's this multi-dimensional views of the world that so many of us just don't see. It's amazing.
Exactly. So
there's two other things I want to get onto before we run out of time.
Yeah.
And the first one is, what is multi-species ethnography? What is that about?
So yes, basically to explore that pluriverse of denizens, you have to expand. As anthropologists, we look at humans. We generally look at humans and how they use plants. But with multi-species, we can extend that vision of like a social network and multi-dimensional network to other beings, not to other denizens. Plants, for example. I worked with. I followed the plants as they were grown, processed, transformed, harvested, sent to the different, like traded through the network, used, and through that observation of the relationships of the plants, I got to see how like people from like you have Yahe shamans, but you also have people who believe in Santeria using these plants, and it's a different concept of health and different concept of body and different concept of everything, but they use the same plant and they translate the practice. So that's how you manage to that's how I managed to explore these, because there's so many.
There's so many different paths and divergent paths. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think people forget too that within the entire Amazon, there are over 400 different tribal groups too, and each group has its own language, way of seeing the world, ways of medicine, ways of being.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to include colonos, white people, the Afro-Colombian or Afro-Brazilians, the rubber trappers. They all have different ways but then there are certain things that they share. And that's what I found, that's where I can tie these things. And it's usually like medicinal plants, for example.
That's great. All right. And my one last question was around this topic of therapeutic emplotment. What is that?
Yeah. So when I was talking about the yahe, how chandur is used during the yahe ceremonies, how like it's used to put you in a like a rhythm, or put you in the times of the ceremony. It's also for the shamans. There's a narrative to this ceremony. So like you start hearing the narrative from before, and you start like linking the narrative to your healing process. And it's usually like, oh yes, I've been hurt and I feel sick. And then you go to the shaman first, they do a cleanse, and they tell you, I know you've been hit with witchcraft. You have to come back and drink ayahuasca with me or yahe with me. So you go back and they give you yahe, and during the whole ceremony, they tell you about how to cure witchcraft, and it's like a plot. So you start putting yourself in the plot of the disease, and also putting yourself in the plot of how to heal yourself.
So it's like self-empowerment in a way.
Yes,
yeah.
in a way. So like they start saying like, oh yes, the best way to do it, we'll drink your head, you'll purge, you'll feel better tomorrow. And then there's a bunch of symbolisms tied to curing that witchcraft. So like, for example, they use Chandora, they use the Waira, they use amulets, they do like the songs are tied to that plot of curing you from that witchcraft. So it's kind of like tying you to that plot or narrative of getting better through their medical system. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, so, it's kind of making you part of the story where you're really the key to healing yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when I say therapeutic emplotment, it's basically that, no? It's tying yourself to using the different tools, symbolisms, perspective of health, your perspective of your body, to make a narrative of yourself, to heal yourself through the process, because the plants can only do so much. You have to also believe in them.
You have to take that, and it's so interesting because in kind of the broad Western medicine, we often are very separated from our ability to treat our own diseases. It's considered something else that we must give ourselves over into the hands of this other medical system and have faith that it and hope that it works. But here it's more about, it seems like you are an integral part of the story, of the storyline.
Even in Western medicine, there's symbolism, no? The doctor wears white. The doctor tells you, I'm going to do an X-ray. I'm going to do this.
The diagnostic.
This is the diagnostic. This is how we're going to cure you. You have to believe in the medicine that the doctor, in the experience of the doctor that's curing you.
Yeah.
And so it's also kind of that, no? It's a healing narrative that you create to get better. And it exists in all medical traditions. And in ayahuasca or yahe shamanism, it's basically using Chandora, using yahe, using all the different plants, and it's beautiful. It's really nice because it is really helpful for mental health. Going back to what we were talking about, because a lot of for example, currently I'm working with Mocoa was devastated by a huge mudslide not many years ago, and there's a lot of post-traumatic syndrome, and there's a lot of people that are traumatized by it. The winters, or we call them winters now, the rainy seasons, are really heavy now due to global change, global warming. They're becoming worse. So people are afraid of their rivers and their land and their forests. And they're starting to go to the shamans, and the shamans are like giving them the plot, like, oh yes, you have to be calm, you have to respect the rivers, you have to kind of understand it, and that helps people understand what happens, and that helps people like deal with their trauma and kind of accept it and move on and like grow with it. So like, yes, it's beautiful that it's well known that some psychedelics are useful for trauma. Yes, and mental health. But it's often overlooked that it's a ceremony that also helps you get over those.
Not just taking a pill of some psychedelic. It's the ritual.
the
really important.
ritual, like even if you consume mushrooms or whatever, it's the idea of like going and having yourself like a ritualized process, a narrative that you create and plot yourself in that narrative, and
Yeah.
that's where you grow and you get out of and you can get better, no, and accept
Yeah.
it.
That's amazing. Well, this has all been super fascinating. We're out of time now, but
Yes, I'm
I
sorry.
do have one last question I like to ask all of our guests, and that is, what is your favorite dish from this region? What's your favorite food from this region where you work?
So they have a chili
Hmm.
that is smoked. It's a
Wow.
little chili powder that is smoked, and it's only found in that region in the Amazon. And and you put it in your soup or anything. It tastes like a smoky, like almost chipotle, but it's
So much
much
better.
more complex. It's amazing. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's great. What is it called?
Chile.
It's
They
just
don't
called
have a
Chile. It's the
name. Yeah.
local Chile for it. Wow. It's great. Well, thank you so much, Hernando, for coming on the show and sharing all of your knowledge of this space. It's really been enlightening to discuss this with you.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me and hope to talk to you soon again and whatever. And you need me to talk more about it. I can talk a lot about it.
That's great. Thank you. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded on Skype. A big shout out of thanks to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, and a big thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. If you want to find this and all of our other episodes, you can grab those on Apple Podcast. You can also check out the video version of this episode at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and we'll see you next time.